It is February 28, 2026. At precisely 2:17 in the morning, American and Israeli aircraft cross into Iranian airspace simultaneously. The operation has been in planning for months. Within the first 90 minutes, over 300 strikes hit military sites, nuclear facilities, ballistic missile stockpiles, and one very specific building in Tehran. When the smoke clears, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the man who has ruled Iran for 36 years, the most powerful figure in the Islamic Republic since its founding, is dead. Iran's response is immediate and total. Hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones launch across the region. U.S. military bases in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Iraq, and the UAE are targeted simultaneously. Israeli cities absorb wave after wave of Iranian fire, and then Iran does the one thing the entire global economy had feared for decades. It closes the Strait of Hormuz, 20% of the world's oil supply, gone, overnight. Oil prices double in 48 hours. Fuel shortages begin appearing across Asia within weeks. The global economy lurches toward the edge of a cliff, and right now, as you are watching this video, the crisis is not over. The Strait has been opened, closed, threatened, and blockaded multiple times in the past 2 months. The world is watching a choke point 21 miles wide and wondering if it will ever fully reopen. But here is what the news will not tell you. This war did not start on February 28, 2026. It started in 1953. And to understand where we are, you have to go back to the beginning. The relationship between the United States and Iran was not always defined by enmity. In the early 20th century, Iran was a constitutional monarchy struggling to control its own enormous oil wealth against the dominance of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, a British corporation that extracted Iranian oil and returned almost none of the profits to the Iranian people. In 1951, an Iranian prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh was elected on a platform of nationalizing the oil industry. He was wildly popular. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine as Person of the Year. He believed, reasonably, that Iran's oil should belong to Iran. Britain, furious at the loss of its oil profits, imposed an embargo and lobbied the United States to act. In 1953, the CIA and British intelligence organized a coup. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was returned to power with full Western backing. Iran's oil was handed back to a Western-controlled consortium. That coup, known in Iran simply as the 28 Mordad, has never been forgotten. It is the original wound. Every Iranian leader since 1953 has been able to point to it as proof that Western powers, when it suits them, will overthrow elected governments and install compliant dictators to protect their economic interests. It is the foundational grievance that explains everything that came after. Shah ruled Iran for 26 years after the coup, backed by American money, American weapons, and American political support. His secret police, Sabak, was trained by the CIA and was one of the most feared internal security organizations in the world. Dissidents were tortured. Political opposition was crushed. The Shah pursued rapid modernization and westernization that alienated the traditional religious establishment and the rural poor simultaneously. By the late 1970s, Iran was an oil-rich country with a deeply repressed, deeply resentful population. In 1979, the revolution came. It was not the revolution anyone in Washington had planned for. It was not a communist revolution, which the CIA had been watching for. It was an Islamic revolution led by a 77-year-old cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini, who had spent years in exile and had been broadcasting revolutionary sermons into Iran on cassette tapes smuggled across the border. The Shah fled. Khomeini returned. And the new Islamic Republic of Iran immediately declared itself the enemy of both the United States, the Great Satan, and Israel, the Little Satan. American embassy staff were taken hostage for 444 days. Washington and Tehran have not had diplomatic relations since. What followed was 4.5 decades of Cold War between America and Iran. Sanctions, proxy conflicts, nuclear standoffs, assassinations, and the ever-present threat of direct military confrontation. February 2026 was not the beginning of that confrontation. It was the point where everything that had been building finally broke through the surface. To understand why the Strait of Hormuz is at the center of this crisis, you need to understand what it actually is. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and from there to the open ocean. At its narrowest point, it is 21 miles wide. Through that 21-mile gap passes approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply, around 17 million barrels every single day. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Qatar all export their oil through the strait. Japan gets nearly 90% of its oil through it. South Korea, India, and China are all heavily dependent on Persian Gulf oil that transits Hormuz. There is no viable alternative route. The pipelines that bypass the strait have limited capacity. Rerouting tankers around Africa adds weeks to journey times and drives up costs massively. For decades, Iran has understood that the Strait of Hormuz is its most powerful strategic weapon, not its army, not its missiles, not even its nuclear program. The strait, the ability to close a 21-mile channel and immediately threaten the economic stability of every major industrial economy on Earth. Iran has threatened to close it in every major confrontation with the United States since the 1980s. On February 28, 2026, for the first time in history, it actually did. The immediate trigger for the 2026 war was not a single event, but the accumulation of a series of escalations that each side convinced itself the other would not match. In January 2026, Iranian security forces massacred thousands of civilians during a crackdown on the largest domestic protest Iran had seen since 1979. President Trump responded with threats of military action and began the largest U.S. military buildup in the Persian Gulf region since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Iran, reading the signals as bluster, continued its nuclear program and refused weapons inspectors access to damaged sites from a previous 2025 conflict. On February 28, 2056, while negotiations between Iran and the United States were technically still ongoing, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. The strikes were coordinated, extensive, and targeted specifically at Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile infrastructure, and its political leadership. Khamenei was killed in the opening hours. Dozens of senior IRGC commanders were killed in the following days. Iran's nuclear facilities were severely damaged, and Iran, as it had always promised, closed the strait. The weeks that followed were the most economically disruptive period in global energy markets since the 1973 oil embargo. Commercial shipping through the strait dropped more than 90% almost immediately. Oil prices surged. Asian nations that depend on Persian Gulf oil began rationing fuel. Insurance premiums for any vessel attempting the strait became prohibitive. Iran selectively allowed ships from friendly nations, China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Iraq, to pass while blocking Western-aligned vessels entirely. The United States announced a naval blockade of Iran on April 13th. Iran responded by closing the strait again. A fragile two-week ceasefire brokered by Pakistan briefly opened a window for diplomacy. Then it collapsed. As of today, April 2026, the strait has been opened and closed multiple times. Talks between Washington and Tehran are described by both sides in completely contradictory terms. Iran says the U.S. is lying about the state of negotiations. Trump says Iran is engaging in blackmail. Ships are still being fired on. A French UN peacekeeper in Lebanon has been killed. The region is in a state of sustained military and economic emergency, with no clear resolution in sight. And behind all of it, behind every missile fired and every tanker turned back, is the 100-year history we have just walked through. The 1953 coup that was never forgiven, the 1979 revolution that rewrote the region, the nuclear standoff that lasted decades, the proxy wars that built toward an inevitable direct confrontation. What does history tell us about how conflicts like this end? The honest answer is, it depends entirely on whether both sides find an exit that lets them claim they did not lose. That is how the Cuban Missile Crisis ended in 1962. Both sides stepped back, both sides saved face, and the secret deal that actually resolved it was not disclosed for decades. That is the model for a managed de-escalation. The alternative model is what happened after the First World War. A conflict that ended with one side humiliated and resentful, setting up the next and larger conflict 20 years later. The United States has destroyed much of Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure, but it has not destroyed Iran. 65 million Iranians are still there. A new leadership will emerge. That leadership will inherit the same foundational grievances, the 1953 coup, the decades of sanctions, the memory of this war, and will have even more reason to pursue the weapons and the alliances that can deter the United States from doing this again. History does not suggest that bombing a country into compliance produces lasting compliance. It suggests it produces lasting resentment that finds a new form. The Strait of Hormuz will reopen. The global economy will stabilize. The war will formally end. But the forces that produce this conflict, the competition for oil, the unresolved Palestinian question, the Iranian revolutionary identity that defines itself against American power, those forces do not end with the ceasefire agreement. They wait for the next moment. That is the lesson every empire in this series has eventually had to learn. You can win a battle and still lose the century. This is The Fallen Empires. If you want to understand what is happening in the world right now, not just the headlines but the history underneath them, subscribe. New episode every week. We will see you there.